For fans of space combat, it's been a long time since we've gotten something like the old Descent Free Space or X-Wing/TIE Fighter games, so Squadrons is an exciting spiritual successor that's been a long time coming. And thank God, Squadrons' return is as triumphant as it is hyped, featuring some stunning visuals, a VR experience that I am truly envious of, and a surprisingly crunchy and involved web of gameplay systems, both in its combat and in its customization. This is a great game that a lot of people are going to enjoy. But in my very specific case, I think there are a lot of barriers that might stop someone from enjoying this game. Many of them stemming from the fact that space sims are a genre as complicated as they are niche, and while Squadrons does its utmost to onboard the less familiar as gradually and carefully as possible, this arguably justified abundance of caution also means that if you're hoping to just jump in and slag some people in multiplayer, you might be staring at hours of homework before you actually get to do what you want. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today, we're becoming ace pilots in Star Wars Squadrons. Squadrons opens up with an interesting choice from a design perspective, a forced 2-mission 45-minute tutorial before you're even allowed to so much as touch the main menu. EA's done this sort of thing before, like with Battlefield 1 and 5's little 5-minute opening vignettes, but to my knowledge, this is the farthest that they've ever pushed the idea. All the same, Squadrons makes the most of this time. The 2 missions are more than just a basic run-through of the controls, following a self-contained mini-story as members of the Empire and Republic battle over the fate of a convoy of refugees from Alderaan. All things considered, it's a great cold open that does a good job explaining the very basics of the game to even a complete space sim neophyte like myself. It also has these slick opening cutscenes that are half normal animation and half heavily stylized to look like the neon tactical maps from the movies, constantly cutting back and forth between the two styles. I honestly wish the entire game looked like this because holy shit are these cutscenes tight. The rest of Squadrons, however, is considerably more grounded than that. Squadrons feels more lived in and realistic in the same way that Rogue One feels more grounded compared to the rest of the movies, especially with the way it's designed its cockpits. But only on rare occasions do the story modes awkward and designed primarily for VR hubs between battles benefit from this more grounded aesthetic. It all made me wish that the main story mode had continued to use those highly stylized, half-traditional, half-incredibly sexy motion graphic cutscenes.
As their empire collapses, they try to tighten their grip. But the galaxy is changing, and you can be a part of it. With the help of brave and daring pilots, this war can end. Make a choice. Fly with the New Republic. Change our galaxy for the better.
Which, speaking of, once you're done with that tutorial, you can go one of 2 directions, either diving into the story or giving multiplayer a go. Though, all that said, literally everyone, including myself and the game, would recommend that you start with the story, because the tutorial lessons aren't even close to over yet. Squadrons is a surprisingly complex game that demands a lot of your attention simultaneously. It's not enough to learn how to properly hook a U-turn and blast somebody in the back. You have different subsystems you have to balance power to, engine boost and weapon charge to balance with those systems, shields you can reorient on the fly, a whole targeting system to wrap your head around, and the incredibly flashy drift to master. There's a lot going on here, and you have to be paying attention to all of it all the time. And that's even ignoring the mostly subtle differences in how Republic and Empire ships work, the far less subtle ways different ship classes for both sides differ, and all the ways you can customize your ship on top. And Squadrons' campaign makes for an excellently structured place to come to grips with all these different systems before you're flung into the middle of a multiplayer dogfight or have to stare down the surprisingly deadly guns of an AI capital ship. It sets up a lot of unique, interesting missions, usually with situations designed to teach you how to fly one particular fighter or another. A lot of them can be pretty big and involved engagements as well, sometimes jumping multiple times to new locations in a single mission, and other times spending 20 minutes absolutely trashing one space station or another. Mechanically, story mode knocks it out of the park with no shortage of variety here, and while I don't have the historical knowledge to really tell you if this lives up to the flight sims of old, it's still a pretty entertaining time. Narratively, though, it's a pretty mixed bag here. A lot of interesting ideas with potential that never quite live up to it in execution. I actually like the idea of playing the game from both sides of the conflict. Victories for one side make life more complicated for the other, so you never have to endure a scripted loss for the heroes to get backed into a corner. You're the one who put them there. And for once, the Republic are the ones making the cool super weapons, and the game also focuses on a much smaller conflict. Instead of being a battle for the fate of the war, it's a much more personal conflict that hangs all of its narrative stakes on your two commanding officers who have opposing ideologies and a personal bone to pick with the other. But all of that potential is let down by a cast of almost universally paper-thin characters. This one's angry, this one's seen shit, this one's seen even more shit, this one's a racer-turned-pilot. There are attempts to build characters here, but most of them only ever amount to a literal single bullet point that they'll repeat over and over. And those commanders, while they chew the shit out of the scene whenever engaging in their rivalry, are similarly left underdeveloped. But even all of these characters feel like they ought to be getting Oscars when they're standing next to one of the most awkwardly shoehorned silent protagonists I've ever seen.
Your Empire needs you, pilot. Are you willing? Good. For now, you will be flying as Titan 3.
And this is the game's greatest missed opportunity. You already have two NPCs that all the emotional stakes revolve around. Why aren't we playing them? They're even starship pilots! Instead, you're the silent tag-along, while cool original character Do Not Steal Lyndon Javes gets all the character development because the player has to play a character with a personality of white bread that they can imprint themselves on more easily. And meanwhile, the characters actually driving the game's action miss out on countless opportunities they could have had to be fleshed out because they're stuck in CIC giving you between mission pep talks all game and only ever get 30 seconds of screen time. But alright, you did the tutorial. You got a feel for the game through the story, and now you're finally ready to blast other people out of the sky in multiplayer. You might have thought we'd be done with the roadblocks by now, but we're not. When you first jump into Squadrons multiplayer, you won't be able to play the game's main mode, Fleet Battles. Arguably, this is the way the game was intended to be played, but you'll have to grind out another 2 hours of team deathmatch before you've leveled high enough to unlock it. In the game's defense, if you haven't played a game like this before, you'll need all that time to get comfortable, and the process of getting there is fun enough that it's hard to really complain. But assuming you go the intended route and complete the tutorial, story mode, and then dogfights, you're looking at 10 hours of gameplay before you even get to touch Squadron's big premiere game mode. You know, the thing they want you to ultimately come to the game for. And for anyone who might only have a few hours a week to play, that is a tough one to swallow. Once I did finally get through all that other stuff though, what little I did get to play the mode was pretty dang fun. Instead of just shooting down the other team, your ultimate goal in this mode is to destroy an enemy capital ship. But instead of forcing both teams to balance offense and defense between only 5 players, each team takes turns performing each role, and you have to go through several stages of progress as you work your way up the opposing fleet's hierarchy until you eventually get to fight its flagship. While the setup sounds very much like a battlefield match but in spaceships, in actual practice it's less tug-of-war and more basketball of all things. It's a 5v5 match that starts with a quick tip-off in the middle, whoever wins gets to go on an offensive drive while the other team forms a defensive scrum to try and keep them out, and eventually once the first team is out of lives and their shot clock runs out, the other team gets their turn to try and slam dunk a big ol' ion bomb on the enemy capital ship. Sorry John boys, they already beat you to making 17-776 but for basketball. And this is a pretty solid setup. The constant back and forth means that one team can't just run away with an early lead, but you can't just swoop in and reverse the game's flow at the last second to steal the win, either. Matches are decently long, but because of how they're designed, it's rare that you'll be sitting there for 20 minutes praying for the game to just please end like you might with a lot of other multiplayer titles. It always feels like you still might have a chance. It also definitely feels like the mode that Squadrons was balanced around. Bombers and support ships can be absolutely devastating in the right hands in dogfight mode, but fleet battles give these ships explicit roles to perform during combat that your standard TIE interceptor just can't. And almost half the weapons in the game are specifically designed for attacking capital ships instead of other players. Dogfights are perfectly fun, but this is the multiplayer mode to come to the game for, which makes it a bit of a shame that it's so much work to get to. But I've been hitting on this same point a few times now, so let's just get to asking. What do you get out of 5 hours with Star Wars Squadrons? I did something a little special this time. I played through that first hour of mandatory tutorial, and then I mapped what your journey might look like from there depending on what you want to do. Playing for 4 hours as someone going straight into the story, then another 4 hours diving into the multiplayer. And no matter what, you're not going to get the absolute complete experience out of this game in only 5 hours, but depending on what you're coming to the game for, it can be more or less of a time commitment. If you're looking to relive your old X-Wing or Descent free space memories, or you just want to enjoy a passable Star Wars story, you'll find a lot to like here right from the get-go, but you'll be at it for longer than just 5 hours. But if the multiplayer dogfighting is all that interests you, you've got a long road ahead of you. Even assuming you skip the story, I only got to play Squadrons main mode twice before my time was up. Thankfully, both sides of Squadrons are pretty well executed, but one is going to require a significantly larger time commitment than the other before you start getting anything out of it. Again, it's hard to give you guys a full-throated recommendation of Squadrons just because of the time commitment it requires, but if you do have the time to get through the game's many barriers to entry, there's something worthwhile to enjoy there. Hey guys, if you like what you're seeing here, consider supporting me on Patreon. With your generous support, I can start doing all kinds of cool stuff like more in-depth video essays and 5-hour streams where I review games like this in real time. So if any of that sounds cool, please consider becoming a patron today. But I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.